The podcast studio was alive with the low hum of equipment, the soft murmur of casual banter, and the faint scent of warm electronics that Taehyung had always found comforting. But the atmosphere shifted the moment Jungkook leaned forward, his expression unreadable, and whispered something that made the red light on the microphone flicker almost like a warning. Taehyung felt a chill crawl down his spine. His fingers tightened around his coffee cup, knuckles whitening, and the laughter from moments ago seemed distant, muffled by the sudden, heavy tension in the air. What are you talking about?" Taehyung asked, trying to keep his voice neutral, forcing a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. Jungkook said nothing. Slowly, deliberately, he connected his phone to the soundboard. The studio producer looked up, slightly confused, but assumed everything was routine. The live broadcast was already flowing to thousands of listeners who had no idea that they were about to witness a fracture in someone carefully guarded facade. A click static, then Taehyung's younger voice filled the studio. Raw, vulnerable, shaking. Words he had thought were buried long ago whispered through the room. "I don't think I can do this anymore. If I disappear, maybe it'll be easier for everyone." Time collapsed into a pinpoint. His breath caught, sharp and painful. His vision blurred as the harsh studio lights streaked into pale halos. That recording had been erased, or so he thought, recorded in the isolation of a small apartment years ago, in the middle of nights that had felt endless and suffocating. Jungkook's gaze never wavered, calm, unreadable, yet heavier than Taehyung could process. "You kept telling everyone you were fine," Jungkook said quietly, almost drowned by the echo of Taehyung's past words. "You said music saved you, but you never told us how close we were to losing you." His hands began to shake. Hatred of weakness, hatred that his own body could betray him, surged with an intensity he had spent years training to suppress. Memories flooded in, unfinished lyrics left scattered across his desk, nights staring at ceilings that felt like they were pressing in, the constant ache in his head, the burden he had believed he carried alone for everyone else's sake. The recording ended with a breath, soft and intimate, too close for strangers' ears. Silence crashed in its wake. Taehyung laughed once, a broken sound startling even himself. "You shouldn't have played that," he said, but the words were weak, powerless. Tears slipped despite him. Jungkook leaned forward, his eyes glimmering with a flicker of remorse. "I shouldn't have stayed quiet either," he admitted. Years of tension between them, carefully managed in unspoken glances and subtle omissions, now spilled into the open. Taehyung, the quiet observer, the man who had carried his pain like a private ritual, realized how isolation had corroded him. The producer's voice crackled, asking if they should cut the feed. Jungkook shook his head. This moment couldn't be interrupted. It was too raw, too necessary. Taehyung wiped at his face, embarrassed and furious, angry at the exposure but also relieved. Crying on air had never been part of the plan, nor had being confronted by the one person who knew him best. "I was scared," he admitted quietly, staring down at the table. "Not of failing, but of succeeding and still feeling empty. I thought if I told you, you'd see me differently." Jungkook softened, the weight of shared pain flickering across his expression. "We already did," he said. "We just didn't know why." For the first time in a long while, Taehyung felt the studio warm, or maybe it was his chest finally loosening under the burden of a secret that had defined him for years. The recording, once a weapon of isolation, had lost its power. The aftermath came in waves. Taehyung's phone buzzed relentlessly, missed calls, messages, headlines. He set it face down, unwilling to face the world yet. Jungkook followed, jaw set, guiding him through the tension. The friends at the dorm were awake, alert to the storm erupting online. Namjoon's calm presence contrasted sharply with the urgency that filled the room, Jimin and Jin hovering, their worry tangible. "You planned that," Taehyung accused quietly as they moved down the hallway. Jungkook paused, pale, a mixture of guilt and resolve on his face. "I planned the truth," he admitted, "not the fallout." Conversations escalated, emotions spilling into words. Anger, relief, Guilt and fear intermingled as the two navigated a fragile intimacy born of years of unspoken understanding. Taehyung admitted his fear of being seen as broken. Jungkook admitted the fear of losing him. The hallway, the waiting room, the familiar furniture, all became the stage for a confrontation that was as much about survival as it was about honesty. By the end of the night, exhaustion won. Taehyung sat alone on the balcony wrapped in a blanket sipping tea. The city was quieter now, softened by early light. Jungkook joined him, silence stretching comfortably between them. "I'm still angry," Taehyung admitted. "I know," Jungkook replied. But anger and relief could coexist, and slowly, Taehyung began to feel something like peace. The secret no longer owned him. He had survived exposure, not because the world had gone quiet, but because he finally refused to hide. Even as the day broke and the relentless notifications resumed, Taehyung's perspective had shifted. He no longer measured himself by silence or the absence of pain. He had been seen, acknowledged, and despite the storm outside, he could exist without apology. The morning after the podcast, the city outside felt indifferent to everything that had unfolded inside the studio. Neon lights reflected off the wet streets as Taehyung sat quietly at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug gone cold. The silence was fragile, almost sacred, but it didn't last long. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Jungkook, moving with a tense urgency, froze at the threshold when he saw the scene. Suits and cameras had filled the hallway, officials requesting immediate statements. "I didn't tell anyone we were here," Taehyung said softly, his voice steady despite the racing in his chest. Experience had taught him that panic rarely solved anything. The executives demanded a formal response, insisting that his emotional livestream wasn't sufficient. "Correction is required," one said, a practiced smile masking the sharp teeth behind it. Jungkook stepped forward, protective but controlled. "Correction of what? His feelings?" he asked. Taehyung's laugh was quiet, humorless. "You don't get to edit my pain," he said, standing taller than he had in days. The tension in the room thickened, thick enough to taste, but Taehyung refused to yield. Namjoon's presence beside him offered calm solidarity. The man's steady gaze was a silent pillar of support. The executives tried to frame the situation as risk management, mentioning sponsors, public perception, and brand protection. Taehyung's hands curled into fists at his sides, the word control setting his nerves on edge. "I've lived with consequences longer than you've known my name," he said quietly but with steel in his voice. Cameras clicked, capturing every micro-expression, but he remained resolute. He would not shrink, not this time. Outside, the world continued its relentless scrutiny. Reporters, fans, and critics dissected the podcast, amplifying snippets, twisting context. One former collaborator circulated an old interview, edited to cast doubt on Taehyung's stability. Commentary questioned his reliability, his strength, and even his moral character. The weight of it pressed in, relentless, but inside the dorm, a different dynamic emerged. Jimin, Jin, and Hobi hovered close, their worry tangible. "People are calling you weak," Jimin said under his breath. "Manipulative," Jin added. Taehyung let the words wash over him, but Jungkook's voice cut through sharply, commanding, "They don't know you. Don't let them define you." For the first time, Taehyung felt a boundary forming, not against the world but around his own vulnerability. He didn't need permission to exist, to speak, to feel. The night stretched long. Discussions flowed, sometimes heated, sometimes quiet and reflective. Taehyung listened more than he spoke, absorbing the perspectives of those who had remained while he had struggled alone. Old misunderstandings surfaced, examined with brutal honesty. Every tear, every confession eased the pressure on his chest. By dawn, the city had quieted, and for a moment, Taehyung allowed himself the luxury of relief. He retreated to his studio, surrounded by the familiar scents of wood and electronics. Fingers hovered over piano keys, hesitant, almost afraid to feel fully. The music that followed was not an escape. It was an acknowledgement. A channel for the complex web of fear, anger, and relief that had settled over him. Jungkook watched quietly from the doorway, silent witness to the release of emotion that was no longer hidden. "This isn't a breakdown," Taehyung said softly, though only to himself. The tears had not signaled weakness but release, a surrender to honesty that allowed him to rebuild. The studio, once a sanctuary of control, had become a cathedral of authenticity. The backlash online was immediate, but Taehyung no longer feared it in the same way. Comments flew, some harsh, some supportive, but he observed them without the same crushing weight. He understood now that exposure was inevitable, that truth carried risk, but the alternative, continued concealment, had been unbearable. Later, Taehyung initiated another live stream, alone in the studio, unfiltered, unscripted. The camera captured him as he truly was, black hoodie, tired eyes, but steady presence. The chat erupted instantly, a torrent of viewers, opinions, and emotions. Taehyung waited for the rush to settle into background noise, then spoke, carefully, deliberately. "I didn't plan to do this," he said, voice steady. "I'm tired of watching people talk about my life like it's a story they own. That recording was not a performance, not a plea for attention. It was a moment of fear, a moment of truth, when I felt I didn't matter." He paused, letting the words land. "I stayed silent because I thought strength meant enduring alone. I was wrong. Strength is asking for help. I am not broken, I was hurting. There's a difference." Outside the frame, Jungkook and the others held their breath, witnessing the reclamation of narrative, the refusal to be reduced to a curated story. "I'm alive because people stayed, because they didn't leave when I pushed them away," Taehyung continued. "If you're listening and feel like disappearing would make things easier for everyone else, don't believe that lie. It's convincing, but it's wrong." The live stream ended. The room behind him erupted, a mixture of relief, astonishment, and quiet pride. Namjoon's eyes met his, steadying him. Jimin swore softly, Hobi held back tears, and Jin's presence was calm but powerful. The narrative outside continued, but inside, Taehyung had reclaimed something fundamental, himself. The days that followed were a delicate balancing act. Interviews, public scrutiny, and internal meetings pressed from all directions. The company called another meeting discussing public reaction, sponsor concerns, and mental health implications. Taehyung attended early, shoulders squared, presence resolute. He outlined boundaries, no scripted apologies, no editing of his words. His voice was firm, the words were unyielding. "You speak on your terms," he told the executives. Silence followed, thick and deliberate. Then, unexpectedly, one of the older executives, usually immovable, nodded. "You've changed." Taehyung allowed a faint smile, feeling the truth of that recognition. He hadn't been broken by exposure, he had been reshaped by honesty. Evenings became quieter, reflective. Music returned as both ritual and refuge. Taehyung played the piano with tears dropping onto keys, allowing the full range of emotion to flow freely. Jungkook watched, silently present, until Taehyung finally spoke. "This is where it started. I don't want to carry it alone this time." Jungkook nodded, tears slipping freely, and simply stayed. The world outside remained noisy, unpredictable, often cruel. Yet within that space, Taehyung found something that had eluded him for years, a foundation of honesty, trust, and resilience. The backlash persisted, shifting like weather, but it was no longer violent enough to unmoor him. He had faced the storm and survived, not unscathed, but unbroken. The following week blurred into a mix of meetings, interviews, and quiet moments where Taehyung could finally breathe. The company attempted to steer the narrative, but he stood firm. "No more scripting," he repeated in each conference room, voice calm but unyielding. "I speak on my terms. Anything else isn't my story." Executives shifted uncomfortably, realizing that control over him was no longer an option. Interviews continued, but this time Taehyung approached them with a new rhythm. He was no longer hiding behind polished smiles or measured words. He answered honestly, without deflecting, without fear. Critics tried to twist his vulnerability into weakness. He countered with quiet firmness. "I'm not asking for protection. I'm asking for understanding. And if you can't give that, then at least give me space." At the dorm, the atmosphere shifted as well. Jin and Jimin offered quiet reassurance, sitting beside him while he scrolled through comments that had once made him anxious, now taken in stride. Hobi cooked meals to break tension. Namjoon remained a steady presence, listening without judgment, and Jungkook stayed close, a silent ally. The bond between them strengthened in ways words couldn't fully capture. Taehyung returned to the piano often. Music became his anchor, a language for the unspoken emotions that still lingered. His fingers danced over keys with intention, the melody soft yet resolute. Tears fell sometimes, unrestrained, but they no longer felt shameful. The release carried weight, yes, but it was purposeful, healing in a way that confrontation alone could not achieve. The live round table interview loomed, a challenge that could either solidify or dismantle his regained control. Cameras, critics, and journalists sat ready, poised like predators. Taehyung arrived early, seat in the semicircle of chairs, cool but alert. Jungkook remained nearby, supportive yet careful not to overshadow. The red recording light blinked, and the questions began. "Some say your openness is brave," a journalist began. "Others say it's calculated. Which is it?" Taehyung held her gaze calm, measured. "It's inconvenient, that's how I know it's real." A murmur swept through the room. Another voice challenged him. "Aren't you placing emotional responsibility on your audience by sharing so personally?" He smiled faintly, the edges tight. "I didn't ask them to carry it, I asked them to listen." Accusations of exploitation were raised. Taehyung's jaw tightened, eyes steady. "Jungkook didn't exploit me. He confronted a silence that was killing me. That's the difference." The room held its breath as words layered meaning and consequence. Anger, clarity, and resolve intertwined in his tone. Gratitude and resentment coexisted, a duality that he carried unapologetically. The discussion intensified. Voices overlapped, assumptions were challenged, but Taehyung remained centered. He didn't over-explain, didn't collapse under pressure. He spoke when it mattered, stayed quiet when silence was stronger. By the end, the room felt exhausted, the energy drained, but there was a subtle reverence in the way his honesty resonated. Back at the dorm, the aftermath of the round table was tangible. Messages of support poured in from fans and strangers alike. The criticism, once overwhelming, was now tempered by a newfound respect for his candor. He wasn't untouchable, but he was undeniably present, undeniably real. Jungkook, Namjoon, Jin, Jimin, and Hobi gathered around him, a collective presence of reassurance. One night, hours after the interviews had ended, Taehyung found himself alone at the piano. Jungkook entered quietly, observing the delicate notes that filled the room. "You never play like this," he said softly. Taehyung didn't look up. "I never let myself feel like this before." The air was heavy, but for the first time the weight felt chosen. He played until the last note faded, fingers lingering on keys as if reluctant to leave the fragile moment behind. Jungkook finally approached, tears glistening, but not for shock or sadness. Simply present, witnessing the reclamation of a self that had been fractured for years. "I'm here," he said. Taehyung nodded, voice soft but steady. "I know." Days passed, and the world outside continued its chaos. Headlines, speculation, and commentary remained constant, but inside the dorm, a quieter, more resilient rhythm had emerged. Taehyung no longer measured himself by public opinion. He measured himself by honesty, by the connections that had remained when others might have left, by the music that spoke when words faltered. He released a song quietly, without announcement, letting the melody convey what words could not. It was not triumphant or bitter, but layered with reflection, restraint, and authenticity. Messages arrived, some from fans, some from strangers, acknowledging their own struggles mirrored in his. "I didn't disappear because you didn't," one read. Taehyung paused, letting the weight of that statement settle, a quiet validation of survival, of persistence. Even as the weeks passed, he faced ongoing scrutiny and pressure from the company. But his approach had shifted. He no longer engaged with demands to edit or manipulate his story. "If it's about my story, I will tell it. On my terms," he declared during another meeting, unwavering. Executives, previously accustomed to controlling narratives, now realized he was not to be managed. In private, he and Jungkook revisited the recording together, reflecting on the moment that had catalyzed this shift. "I hated hearing your voice like that," Jungkook admitted. "It sounded like goodbye." Taehyung leaned against the counter, thoughtful. "It wasn't meant to be heard. It was meant to remind me that I stayed. And now it reminds me that I can face the world without hiding." Tears came again, but this time they were not of fear. They were acknowledgement, acceptance, and release. Jungkook held his shoulder, steady and unjudging. "I don't regret playing it," he said softly, "but I regret hurting you." Taehyung considered it, then smiled faintly. "I forgive you. It's part of why I'm still here." Months would follow, with varying challenges, public scrutiny, and private reflections. Yet for Taehyung, the defining change was internal: the reclamation of control, the courage to face the world unfiltered, and the ability to speak truthfully without apology. Music became his voice where words were insufficient. The past remained a scar but not a shackle. It was a testament to survival. Even in the noise of the world outside, Taehyung had found silence that was neither suffocating nor avoidant. It was deliberate, introspective, and real. A silence that allowed him to listen, to process, and to finally exist on his own terms. Jungkook remained by his side, constant, not as a crutch but as an ally, a witness to the quiet strength that Taehyung had long cultivated and was now finally ready to own. The public's response intensified as clips of the podcast went viral. Social media exploded with opinions, some supportive, many critical. Headlines screamed, twisting moments of vulnerability into clickbait. Taehyung, however, no longer reacted with panic or shame. He observed, measured, and let the noise flow around him, grounded by the presence of Jungkook and the other members who had remained unwavering through the chaos. At the dorm, the atmosphere was tense but protective. Jin prepared breakfast quietly, Namjoon monitored official messages, and Jimin paced, frustration etched across his face. "They're still calling him weak," Jimin muttered, tossing his phone onto the counter. Hobai leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Doesn't matter, we know the truth." Taehyung, sitting at the table with a mug of tea, nodded. "That's enough," he said softly. "Enough for him and enough for the people who mattered most." The company demanded a response. Executives pressed for statements, interviews, and a narrative that could be controlled. Taehyung agreed to speak, but only on his terms. The cameras were set in the studio, the lighting bright yet neutral, nothing scripted. He wore a simple black hoodie, no makeup, no stylist, eyes tired but focused. Jungkook stood beside him, a quiet anchor, while the team remained in the control room, supporting silently. "I'm not here to explain myself," Taehyung began, voice firm, carrying over the microphones. "Nor am I here to perform vulnerability as entertainment. That recording was a moment of fear, a moment when I thought I might disappear, but I stayed. And I'm still learning to be honest about it." The chat erupted, some accusing, some supporting, some simply in awe. He ignored it all, focusing on the clarity of his own words. Questions came fast, journalists testing him, critics prodding. "How do you respond to accusations that this was calculated?" a reporter asked. Taehyung met her gaze directly. "It wasn't calculated, it was inconvenient, that's how I know it's real." Another challenged him on responsibility, saying he placed emotional weight on the audience. "I asked them to listen," he said, "not to carry my pain." The tension in the room shifted, subtle but palpable. The interview continued, layered with probing questions about Jungkook's involvement. Taehyung spoke carefully but honestly. "He didn't exploit me. He confronted a silence that was killing me, and he did it because he cared, not because it would make a story." He paused, letting the weight of the statement settle in the room. Gratitude and anger existed side by side in his tone, authenticity cutting through skepticism like sunlight through fog. After the livestream ended, Taehyung and Jungkook retreated to the dorm. Exhaustion and relief mingled, but there was a sense of accomplishment. The truth had been spoken, unfiltered. The narrative, while still alive outside, could no longer shape him entirely. Taehyung sank into the couch, blanket draped over his shoulders, eyes following the flicker of city lights outside. Jungkook sat beside him, hands folded, presence steady. Days passed with fan messages flooding inboxes, some supportive, some confused. But the overwhelming theme was recognition. People began to understand that honesty carried consequences, but also freedom. Taehyung read each message carefully, allowing gratitude and reflection to replace fear. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his own survival in a concrete way. Music returned as ritual. Taehyung played the piano for hours, fingers moving over keys with intention, translating emotions words could not capture. Jungkook often stayed in the doorway, witnessing quietly. This was no longer a performance or a breakdown. It was the articulation of truth, a reclamation of control, a way to process what had been buried for so long. The company, observing the public shift, tentatively approached him. Executives spoke of new opportunities, campaigns for mental health interviews and documentaries. Taehyung considered each carefully, his boundaries clear. "I will engage only on my terms," he said. "No scripted apologies, no editing of my words, no performances disguised as honesty." The room, once accustomed to dictating his narrative, fell silent, recognizing his resolve. Evenings at the dorm became quieter, reflective, yet filled with subtle warmth. Meals were shared, laughter returned in small doses, and conversations deepened. Taehyung began to speak more openly, not just to the members but to himself. Jungkook remained by his side, sometimes offering insight, sometimes just presence, embodying a stability Taehyung had long denied himself. One night, as rain drummed lightly against the windows, Taehyung played the piano again. Jungkook entered quietly, seating himself at the edge of the room. "You've changed," he said softly. Taehyung didn't look up. "So have you," he replied. Music continued, a conversation beyond words. Tears fell not from fear but from the recognition of survival, of truth finally spoken, of trust reaffirmed. Public scrutiny continued, but Taehyung's approach shifted from reaction to intention. He engaged selectively, deliberately, speaking only when necessary, letting music and authentic statements convey what could not be fully articulated. Every day, he reclaimed more control over his life and narrative. Weeks later, an opportunity arose for a live panel with critics, journalists, and fellow artists. Cameras, lighting, and tension were present, but Taehyung approached it with calm authority. Jungkook remained a steadying presence, and the members offered moral support from the edges of the room. When the red light blinked, he spoke without hesitation. "Truth is not always comfortable," he began. "It's messy. Vulnerability is not weakness. I'm not broken, I was hurting, and I stayed. I am still learning, still surviving. If my story helps even one person feel less alone, then the risk of exposure was worth it." The room was still for a long moment, then murmurs of acknowledgement passed through, subtle but sincere. After the panel, Taehyung returned to the dorm, breathing deeply. The external storm remained, but internally he was grounded. Music, honesty, and the presence of those who cared created a foundation stronger than fear, stronger than scrutiny. Jungkook approached, a small smile on his face. "You've faced everything," he said quietly, "and you're still here." Taehyung nodded, chest finally easing. "Because I didn't disappear," he said. For the first time, the weight of the secret no longer threatened to crush him. The recording, the public scrutiny, the backlash, all had been navigated, processed, and survived. He understood now that truth carried risk, but also liberation. And in the quiet moments that followed, as the city pulsed beyond the window, Taehyung finally felt something he had long denied himself. Peace, fragile but real, earned not by hiding, but by standing fully in the light of his own story. Weeks turned into months, but Taehyung's approach to life remained anchored in honesty. The world outside continued to spin with relentless energy, social media posts, headlines, commentary. But inside the dorm, a calmer rhythm had emerged. The members were his constants: Jungkook, Jin, Jimin, Namjoon, Hobi, and the others. Their presence was a reminder that survival was not solitary, that trust was not fragile when nurtured, and that honesty, though risky, could coexist with resilience. Taehyung often reflected on the recording that had started it all. Once a symbol of fear and despair, it now stood as a testament to endurance. Each time he replayed its memory, he no longer flinched. Instead, he acknowledged it, let it linger, and then moved forward. Jungkook, quietly supportive, never left his side, sharing the weight and the release alike. "We faced it together," Jungkook said one night as Taehyung strummed the piano softly in the dimly lit studio. "I never left." Taehyung's lips curved into a faint smile. "And I never will," he replied. Public scrutiny persisted, but Taehyung had transformed how he engaged. Statements were measured, interviews purposeful, and music became his truest outlet. He released songs without fanfare, letting melodies carry emotion and authenticity that words alone couldn't. Fans responded, some with tears, others with shared stories, but all with the understanding that this was a human being speaking from lived experience, not a curated image crafted for applause. At the company meetings, his boundaries were no longer negotiable. "If it's my story, I speak for myself," Taehyung stated clearly, eyes unwavering. No more scripts, no more edits, no more silencing. Executives, once accustomed to controlling his narrative, learned the limits of their authority. They realized that Taehyung had claimed agency over his own life, and any attempt to dictate it would be met with quiet, steadfast resistance. Within the dorm, laughter returned in small, intentional doses. Meals were shared, conversations stretched late into the night, and moments of vulnerability were met with understanding, never judgment. Jin would tease quietly, Namjoon would offer reflective insights, Jimin and Hobi maintained warmth and humor, and Jungkook remained the steady presence, always attentive, never overbearing. Taehyung, for the first time in years, allowed himself to exist without the constant need to shield, to strategize, or to hide. Music sessions became more frequent. Taehyung sat at the piano, fingers gliding over keys, translating raw emotion into sound. Tears sometimes fell silently, evidence not of weakness but of release. Jungkook would remain in the doorway, silently absorbing the process. "This is your language now," Jungkook said once, watching the music flow. Taehyung nodded. "It's how I speak without words, how I survive without hiding." One evening, after a particularly long session of recording new material, Taehyung and Jungkook stepped onto the balcony together. The city lights shimmered below, distant yet present. Silence stretched between them, comfortable, grounding. "Do you ever regret it?" Jungkook asked softly. Taehyung shook his head. "Not for a second. Everything, the fear, the exposure, the criticism, it brought me here, to this moment, to honesty." The secret recording, once a catalyst for pain and fear, now existed as a scar, visible but no longer oppressive. Each interaction, each tear, each confrontation had reshaped him. He understood that life was not about perfection or control or curated images. It was about navigating vulnerability, claiming autonomy, and building connections that endure. The public continued to watch, speculate, and comment, but Taehyung had reclaimed the power of perspective. He no longer measured his value by external validation. Instead, he measured it by truth, by resilience, and by the quality of presence he brought to those who mattered most. Every song he played, every interview he gave, and every candid moment with the members became a testament to a life lived authentically. In private moments, he reflected on the growth within himself. "I stayed," he whispered one night, alone in the studio. "I faced it, I didn't disappear, and I am still learning how to live openly, how to feel, how to exist without hiding." Jungkook appeared beside him without a word, simply listening, simply witnessing. No applause was needed, no validation required. The silence carried its own meaning, a shared understanding, a mutual acknowledgement of survival and growth. Later that week, Taehyung released another song. Quietly. No announcement, no staged reveal. It was raw, reflective, and layered with vulnerability. Fans and listeners responded not with frenzy but with recognition. Messages poured in, some thanking him for sharing, some reflecting on their own struggles, some simply acknowledging that honesty could exist without being weaponized. Each note of support, each personal story, reminded Taehyung that survival was communal as much as personal. At night, after the dorm had quieted and the city hummed softly outside, Taehyung sat at the piano one last time for the day. Jungkook joined him, leaning against the doorframe. "You've changed," he said, voice low, almost reverent. Taehyung's hands hovered over the keys, breath even, eyes thoughtful. "So have you," he replied. Music filled the room, not as a release from pain, but as a declaration of life, of survival, of the power of being unafraid to show oneself fully to the world. Taehyung realized that the world outside, headlines, criticism, speculation, would never truly quiet itself. But that no longer defined him. The truth of his life, his voice, his choices, and his relationships were his to control. Vulnerability was no longer a threat. It was a foundation. Every note played, every word spoken, every moment of courage became proof that survival wasn't passive. It was active, intentional, and profoundly human. As dawn crept over the skyline, Taehyung stood on the balcony with Jungkook beside him, sipping tea in silence. The city pulsed below, vibrant, unyielding. "Are you ready?" Jungkook asked quietly. Taehyung inhaled deeply, the air crisp and new. "I've always been ready," he said, voice steady, eyes lifting to the horizon. "I just didn't know it until now." For the first time in years, the weight of secrecy had lifted. The world could watch, judge, or praise, but it no longer held power over him. He had faced fear, exposure, and vulnerability, and emerged not unscathed but empowered. Music, honesty, and the presence of those who truly cared had forged a resilience stronger than any headline or critique. Taehyung looked over at Jungkook, gratitude and quiet pride in his eyes. "We did it," he murmured. Jungkook smiled faintly, reaching over to rest a hand briefly on Taehyung's shoulder. "No," he replied. "You did it, I just stood here." Taehyung nodded, the sun rising behind the cityscape. A new day began, not perfect, not without challenge, but real, unfiltered, and fully his own. The recording, the podcast, the exposure, they had all been chapters, not the conclusion. Taehyung understood now. Survival was a continuous act, courage was ongoing, and truth, though often inconvenient, was always worth claiming. He stepped back inside, closing the balcony door with intention, ready to continue writing the story of his life, unafraid and unapologetically himself.